go, Jim. He's dead.
Hello and welcome to Improv Autopsy. I'm your host, Stephen Cadwell. Thanks for joining me on this exploratory journey. The purpose of this podcast for me was to scratch an improv itch. I currently live in an area that is a bit of an improv desert. While I try to get an improv community together, I thought this podcast would be an outlet. What I found is that I'm really enjoying hearing people's stories. I find it inspiring and hope you do as well. All of our improv origin stories are different. Hey, that would have been a good name for the podcast as well. And our journeys after finding this crazy art form are equally as diverse and fraught with hurdles and triumphs. One of the reasons I wanted to do this was to validate your stories, the stories of improvisers I'm not as familiar with, those of you who participate in ecosystems that don't get enough credit. And I'm thoroughly enjoying hearing your stories and seeing your scars. The other side of this that has been a real joy for me is learning things about people with whom I improvised for years and I consider friends. Today's interview falls into that category. This episode is part one of my talk with David Charles, aka Dr. D, aka ImprovDoctor.com. The first thing I'd say about David Charles is that he's an amazing improviser. He's also incredibly passionate about improvisational theater. One of the first things I heard about Dr. D is that he has a doctorate in improv. This isn't technically true, and he wouldn't phrase it that way. Strictly speaking, it's a PhD in theater history, criticism, and dramatic literature from LSU with an emphasis in global improvisational movements and trends. I don't think you can get a PhD in improv yet, or at least when I do a search, I only find one program, and that's for music. If you were looking to get one yourself, Dr. D would be the person conferring it. Dr. D had his feet planted in academia and improv performance almost since he started his journey. There's a type of improviser out there that can be lazy. They do improv because they can't be bothered to learn lines or rehearse, not because of the love of the art per se. They just want to get the laughs, soak in the accolades, and go home. David Charles, on the other hand, is an improv craftsperson, an improv artisan. He will both subject himself to stupid fun in the gamiest of short-form scenes, delighting in every second, and also create long-form structures that are intricate and awe-inspiring. Dr. D has crafted many forms, and I had the pleasure of being in a run of his lost comedies of William Shakespeare. And they are put together with purpose and attention to detail that only a lover of the art form can provide. If I had to point to a person who was doing all that was possible to forward the art of improv as legitimate theater, it would be Dr. D. As a theater student in undergrad, we were told that part of our mission was proselytizing for theater, so that live theater didn't disappear. Many people in ignorance don't see improv as legitimate theater. They would never include it in a season at their civics or community or educational theaters because they see it as something lesser. Dr. D proselytizes for improv within those communities, and his creations are fully improvised offerings that will awe, delight, and inspire audiences as much or better than any scripted play. Like I said, along with all of this, Dr. D is an amazing improviser. He is a joy to play with, and you will be extra impressed by his Shakespearean and musical improvisational talent. He's gracious and accepting and rolls with even the most mischievous of scene partners. You can see him at SAC Comedy Lab and in his current concoction for the lab called R&D. Check the calendar for show dates. I hope you enjoy part one of David Charles' Improv Autopsy. First of all, thank you, Dr. D, for joining me and agreeing to do this. I really appreciate it. To start with, do you remember what your first encounter with improv was, when you first saw or experienced something that you knew was improv?
I'm not sure if I know the very first moment, but I know my first memory, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Because as I'm a Kiwi, for those who don't recognize my bizarre accent now, having lived in America for so long. But yeah, so I'm a New Zealander by birth, and in high school, at Logan Park High School in Dunedin, New Zealand, that's where I went to high school, there was just some good money available for theatre sports. It had got national sponsorship by a building society, so people were coming in to teach theatre sports in high schools. There was this golden 3 years in the 80s, late 80s in New Zealand. So we had some great instructors coming in. Stacey Taylor is one of them, a truly remarkable improviser. And so I remember a workshop, And one of the games that she was teaching, so it was very much this theatre sports canon, lots of short form kinds of games. And she'd pitched, all right, we're going to play song now. And there was the predictable ripple of what, no, we're not, going through the group of teenagers. And there was something in me that was like, oh yeah, I'll give that a try. And I got up and sang a song with others on the stage, and that was the moment I was hooked. There was both the inexplicable bravery of volunteering, but that it wasn't a complete train wreck, that I actually created some semblance of a song. And I don't remember ever doing anything like that in front of an audience until that moment. And then I was in. And theatre sports became a huge part of my last couple of years of high school.
Had you sung before then? I mean, were you in choir or choral or anything?
I'm a church kid, right? I'm a PK, so yeah, singing in churches, and I think I might have done some. I have to give Denise Walsh a shout out. She's passed, but she was the drama teacher. She would write a lot of our shows for the high school because she created these huge ensemble pieces. Like if you wanted to be in a show when you were 14 in that high school, you raised your hand and you were in the show. It was called the junior show, and she would create these big fantasy worlds with big groups of characters, and sometimes they would sing songs that we would sort of make up the lyrics for, and someone might put a tune to them. And so I'd done a little bit of that as well, and because she just didn't like the canon and we didn't have a lot of money for royalties, so there was a pragmatic as well as an artistic reason. So I think I'd sung a little bit, and I think I've joked in the past about, like, I was a kid who would make up songs walking to and from school when I was young. I had some interest, I suppose, in that. I just didn't think it was a thing. I didn't think it had a name. Thought that was just me being slightly crazy, making up lyrics. So yeah, a little bit of quote-unquote more traditional theatre. But that was the moment. And I think it was also the moment where I think a lot of people have this story of just realizing that weird thing I did had a name, that it had a community, and that it had a value. I still feel the surprise we all had, myself included, that I hadn't created a train wreck of a song, that it had actually made some sense. And Stacey commented as much. It's like, oh, that was surprisingly good. And then we sort of moved on. And it's like, oh, okay, I want more of that.
Now, you said it was part of your life after that, theatre sports. Did they continue to do stuff at your school?
Yeah, so again, this golden age of the theatre sports, which I think I'm the only person who uses that phrase. But as I've looked back, because the funding only lasted 3 years for the late 80s, we had national high school competitions with funding to go to different centres to play and represent your region. We had huge theatre sports shows. And New Zealand's one of these younger countries that has sort of touring house theatres, that we may not have those touring shows anymore, but you have like surprisingly nice little gems of theatres scattered all over the country. And so we're doing theatre sports in these really theatrical spaces. I think right from word dot, when we were corresponding about this chat, and in the pre-chat you were talking about me having a bit of a theatrical sense to my improv, and I think that is where it all started. It's like, oh, improv has a lighting improviser. Of course it does.
Yeah.
Oh, of course it has that. Of course we're all dressing nicely. Oh, of course there's sound or a musician in the space. And yes, a lot of North American improv certainly does that as well. But I think, we both cut our teeth a lot at Sat Comedy Lab in Orlando, and that's a very musically rich and technically produced venue. And when you step away from that, you're like, oh, wait a second. This is not a given. This is not what every venue has.
Yeah, and it does bring so much to the table.
Absolutely. And for good or evil, it made me believe as a 16 and 17-year-old that it was equivalent to scripted theatre. There was no, and the improv thing that's happening. Now, there were people in my life that I respected from my more traditional theatre training who definitely had a stop wasting your time with that improv stuff, David. There were certainly some of that narratives, and those have stuck with me through most of my professional career. But I think at that moment, it's like, oh no, this is cool. This is celebrated. This is a big thing. And there's nothing quite as intoxicating as feeling like you're in the ground level of something that's swelling and becoming big and important.
Yeah.
So I think I got my first paycheck as an actor was as an improviser when I was about 17. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a thing.
And you've been trying to earn a living with it ever since.
Yeah. No, I do look back and thinking for exchange rate and inflation, those first paychecks were probably amongst some of the best I've received. I peaked at 17. Otago University is in Dunedin, New Zealand, and that's one of our big New Zealand universities. It's a big deal in New Zealand to be a university town. And they had big halls and lecture theatres, and we would fill those for the family shows. And because it was new and young, and Dunedin's about 100,000 folks, 120 now, I think, something in that vicinity, that the professional squad of teachers, I think they were just actively looking for people to flesh out the community. There weren't 40 of them. There were maybe 8 of them. If you showed interest and commitment and a modicum of talent, there was a potential you'd be on the stage playing with them 2 months later.
That's amazing. The high school version of myself is very jealous.
Yeah, no, and it was this funding because, and again, this is maybe the steps you've followed as well. It can be hard to make a living as an improviser, and I think many of us have teaching as part of what we do to make that work. But even then, there's no guarantee there's going to be good payment. And so, yeah, it's very different when you've got a national sponsor saying, we will pay improv coaches to go into high schools. And so that service, it may not have been free to Logan Park, but I'm guessing it was. It's just like, we'll give you this programming for free. We're going to provide the instructors. They'll come in. You don't need to do anything. That's a very attractive model for an education system. I think I was a bit spoiled. Well, I think I've been spoiled in in many ways during my eclectic improv and acting career. Yeah.
So those would have been your first shows. Did you have any sort of formal class other than the workshops that the theater sports were doing, like a SAC level 1 or anything like that?
That's a good question. That may have existed, but because I was in the high school league or wing of it, we had rehearsals with Dunedin Impro, I believe, was the producing organisation for theatre sports in my hometown. And so I do remember after I'd graduated high school, I had about 6 months before I came to America, because the academic calendars in New Zealand, we run on the January-December calendar. That's our academic calendar. So there was this odd amount of time waiting for August to start for me to begin my college career in America when I came over here. And so in addition to working at a chocolate factory, Cadbury's, I remember doing workshops with the improv troupe there as well. And I tried to keep in touch with them as much as I could when I was traveling back and forward. But I don't remember something quite as structured as... Because are you a student of, as well as a player for the SAC model? That's a part of your history. I don't know. Did you go through the SAC classes as well, Stephen?
I did. I feel very lucky in that my first encounter with improv was in college, and the first acting class at Western was improv. That was before Acting 1. We had to take improv. And it was taught by Lyda Stillwell, marvelous person, and she was, I don't know how connected exactly, but there's not too many degrees of separation between her and Viola.
Yeah.
So it was an entirely different experience than like the class at SAC, the level 1 at SAC. It was definitely improv as acting, improv as theater, not improv as comedy. And so that was my introduction, and I think it really did shape a lot of my improv aesthetic.
Oh, I hear that 1,000%, because in Dunedin, the improvisers, they were also the actors. I would go and see them doing shows in the local professional theatres or in the university theatres. And some of them were devised and they were making them up. Some of them had a very much of an improv kind of vibe, and others were scripted. And it was often many people of the same cohort. So for me, there was this beautiful slippage. It's like, yeah, it's all the same thing.
Yeah.
And because it was a bit of a, I suppose we'd call it an extracurricular at Logan Park, it wasn't fully embraced, but I could feel even my drama coach, because she did devised work. I just didn't know at 17 that's what it was called. She would write a bit of a script and we would try it, and she would go away and write a bit more, and then we'd try that, and then she'd edit it and put it together. So we were devising. So she was using improv all over the place.
Yeah.
But there was a little bit of a tension there just because of resources. And when it became really clear, I went to one of our national high school improv events, and so I think she could feel me being pulled away from other things on campus. That created a little bit of a tension. But to speak to the other side of it, like one of the things, I'm doing some classes a little bit more regularly, some sort of one-off master classes at SAC, and part of me also loves teaching it in a non-theatre department kind of setting. There are definitely pluses to both models of coming at it from theatre to being in an environment where it's like, okay, people are looking for an outlet and may not have a deep history in theatre or the time and resources to focus on theatre training. This is part of a much bigger picture for them. So I do like both of those models.
Yeah, I love that as well, because if you believe, as I think we both do, that improv is theater, then they may not be seeing that as an inroad into theater. It's just an outlet, but really it's opening the door to so much more than just strictly improv once you get them in the door and introduce them to improv.
The older I get, the more I'm just starting to go, well, yeah, improv is just interpersonal communication. Do you know what I mean? It's like rarefied and theatricalized, and we're trying to create moments of worth, but just in the same way that a playwright cuts out the shout. It's like, okay, yeah, you don't see characters just sitting on a couch for 4 hours. We cut away the less interesting parts of humanity and focus on the important moments. And that's really been improv, I think, in my experience, for like the last 20, 30 years. I think often it's more valued outside theatre departments than it is in, because everyone's like, oh my gosh, I see the value that this has, and we can monetize it.
Yeah.
You know?
I don't know if what you say about couch sitting stands true entirely, because Kayla and I did just see Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and there's a little bit of couch sitting in that.
Yeah, quite a bit of couch sitting. But I think there's also a lot of trauma dumping and, and intense backstory, right?
Yeah. You don't get that in all your improv?
Oh, I do in some. Like, I think to your point, one of the things I loved about theatre sports and that has stuck with me is that notion that a really dramatic scene could be just around the corner at any moment, and that in the performance event we always remained open to that. And I've been in venues that struggle a little bit with that sense of stylistic inclusiveness, but that's one of the things I love. It's like, yeah, you can have a profound moment, and yeah, I live for those.
Yeah, they bring a lot of texture that you don't have if you're just kind of goofing off. And I will say that when Kayla and I were watching the first R&D that you did, the scene 3 ways that you were doing for an extended period, that first scene that you did with Robbie, there's still the sax sensibility, but I loved that you guys weren't shying away from some of the tender moments, and it ended on a very tender moment, even that first scene. It brings so much to the stage than just going for the laugh or going for the funny when you have that something there to support it, for it to stand on. It's even funnier when it lands.
Yeah, I think, and again, it's hard for me to know because I still feel foreign in many ways, but the American market's the one I know. And I do feel improv and comedy have become perhaps even dangerously synonymous in a lot of North America. And I think we can limit ourselves as performers, and we can limit our audiences, because, you know, I remember that show quite well because going in, so my improv collaborator on the stage is Robbie Pygott, and I loved that he thought when I pitched it that R&D stood for Robbie and David, which it sort of does. And it's like, wait a second, that means something else. It's like, yeah, it means research and development. So that's part of our intro too. But yes, we were contemplating that particular performance. We committed to a different format every first act when we do it. We both went in with like, yeah, let's think of this as an O'Neill play. Let's think of this as something really substantial. And then when we do the play repeated in 3 different styles, and I think we did noir, Shakespeare, and musical, then the distance between the drama and those increasingly stylistic devices, it just increases the comedy as well as the engagement. One hopes, right? One hopes.
Now, I believe you said something. In my memory, you said something. I don't know if you'll remember this. And this speaks to, I think, the same thing that we're talking about. But Kayla and I, when we were still living down there, I have a friend who's lived in Chicago for years. So I think we came up to visit Chicago, maybe to see him. I don't know why we were there at that particular time. And we went to see a comedy sports show when we were in Chicago.
Yeah.
And I'll see if you remember any of the rest of this or if you can even piece it together. But we were talking about it in the green room, and you said, oh, did they do 5 things?
Yeah.
And we said yes. And then you said...
Was one of them bungee jumping off the Eiffel Tower into some flavor of Jell-O?
Yes. And the answer was yes. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And I was, that was an eye-opening moment for me in terms of, oh, goodness. That seems like I would try to avoid getting the same suggestions like that instead of leaning into it happens every time, so we'll just deal with it.
So I feel I have to give some context here for that. 'Cause I don't know if you remember this. So I had 4 years in Chicago, right? I went to Roosevelt, was my undergrad. So I played with Chicago comedy sports on and off for 3 years. Yeah. That was my experience. And now, to your point, I think we always, when we went into 5 things, we always tried to get different things, right? And especially because at that point they were performing at the Congress Hotel right across the road from Roosevelt. There was that very cliched 2-drink minimum. And so as the evening got on, the audience was less and less fun to play with, and you became less and less inclined to wrestle with them to get something new. And so I vividly remember, again, I'm not sure if it's a true memory, Stephen, or an invented one, where someone was like, well, at least let's get a different flavor of Jell-O. You know, like if they're going to give us that. But yeah, no, I think it might have been in the Twin Cities, and this was a while ago. This might have been 8 or 10 years ago, that they had a comedy sports franchise, and it's like, oh, it'll be interesting to go and see. And I had a similar moment of that's a very slick franchise and requires an enormous amount of skill as an improviser to play at that tempo and at that sort of high octane frequency. But it is a very slick and produced show. And yeah, I very much had if I had a slightly better memory, I could walk up onto the stage right now and recreate all of those things that I did in my late teenage years and early 20s back in Chicago.
I understand it on some level because when I was working at Disney, it was interacting with people, and so it was improv in that way, but there were some times when I either couldn't get a group of people or the group of people I had weren't really terribly interested in the interaction, and so there's the stuff that you fall back to because you know that it works and it gives the best experience for everybody. I mean, I empathize. I'm not calling anybody out for that. I was just amazed at oh goodness, it's still happening.
And especially commercial improv, and again, a shout out to Comedy Sports. It's one of the few improv ventures where you will be paid.
Yeah.
You will go into that presuming you will be paid. And so there is always a tension, I think, in those moments between process and product, whereas some of the, for lack of a better term, more avant-garde kind of styles that perform under the improv banner as well are often much less concerned with how many people are in attendance, and in fact might celebrate if it's essentially only family members of the cast and other students of the venue. That's almost their production model. But I think Comedy Sports is very much or at least in my day, it may have changed, was very much we're trying to appeal to a quote-unquote regular audience.
Yeah, I think at least in Chicago, they were hit pretty hard by COVID, so they are no longer in the space that they were in when Kayla and I saw them. But the new owners of I.O. have carved out a space, so they do shows at the I.O. space
Good.
So they're still around, they're just not over on off of Belmont. And Comedy Sports is also one, they had a tech at least. I can't remember if the shows that I saw had musician.
But yeah, the ones I remember best were, we're talking about early 90s, so this is quite some time ago, was in the Congress Hotel, and in the back of the space there'd be someone on a microphone and there would be a keyboardist. So the microphone person would be the announcer and maybe doing some sort of live sort of sound effects. They might have been operating basic lights as well. Yeah.
Okay.
But we were sort of in a carved out, probably a space that was intended to be a bar or a lobby kind of space in a hotel. So the lighting tech part of it, to my recollection, was pretty modest, especially compared to those. Like, I remember shows in Dunedin where we would share university spaces, and we had a lighting technician that'd just done a show in the inverse round. I don't even know what to call it. The audience was sitting in the middle of the space, and on scaffolding around them was the stage.
Okay.
And so you could swivel around on your pillow or your little chair. And so I still have these really vivid memories. I wish I could remember his name to give him a shout out, but he was our sort of technical improviser. And for the whole show, he was just climbing through scaffolding, changing lights, and this incredible level of technical support. So yeah, I do think, and again at SAC we're blessed with that, right? Because we also just have a community of top-rate technical improvisers, many of whom are making their living in the theme parks.
Yeah.
So I think when we talk about technical improvisers, maybe Loose Moose up in Canada, which I want to get to someday, I know they have technical improvisers as well, or scenographers, but I think that's not the norm.
Yeah, and even oddly enough, like you were saying, it's some of the avant-garde places, but some places I kind of maybe even celebrate in some weird way that they don't have all that stuff and think that makes it more pure, and I would disagree.
Yeah, or just different. I try not to get too snobby about it, because in some ways I've got this improv troupe at Rollins where I teach, and because of space issues, we have run the gamut. We've gone from having this really decrepit converted chapel that was loved but was literally falling down around us, but it was used as a studio space, so it would have light and sound equipment in it that was quite nice, to being in a classroom for a couple of years that felt like a bad conference room, with so low ceilings you couldn't do much at all. And then we're now finally, in my 22nd year at Rollins, we've got a custom-built black box theatre the improv troupe has some shared occupancy of. But that's also the building I was promised 22 years ago when I arrived at Rollins and told, it's coming means soon. It took 2 decades, yeah.
Yeah, well, that might be soon in institutions.
Oh, yeah, no, you're probably right. By institutional standards, I'm also retiring soon. Yeah, yeah.
Just to say that the tech and all of that's value added, or it adds a lot. Not that you can't do great improv without it.
Yeah, I agree. But you also have done shows with me where I want to add as many bells and whistles as I can. But I also like to strip down stuff as well, yeah. But I think that's the theatrical part of us, that it's lovely to have a spotlight to step into.
Yeah.
And to have a soundtrack that changes to the scene.
Yeah.
And changes the scene because you've got a musician who's really paying attention.
Okay, so between high school then and when you're doing comedy sports, or maybe even when you're doing comedy sports when you're in Chicago, were there any groups that you were in that time period, or even after, that had names that were like distinct entities?
Yeah, no, to some degree. So I was really lucky to be on scholarship at Roosevelt. And I was a young boy in a department that the theatre departments always need their male presenting actors to do a lot of duty. So I was very lucky to get cast a lot. So that limited what I could do. And I think my theatre historian brain hadn't clicked in at that point. I was very actor focused, so I looked back on my years in the early 90s in Chicago. I was like, why didn't you go see a show at The Annoyance? Why didn't you visit Improv Olympic? Why? Do you know what I mean? It was just like, I'd heard of these things in passing, but I didn't realize quite the heyday that was happening at that moment. So luckily, some of that improv came to campus. So we had Linnea Forsberg, who's Josephine Forsberg's daughter, and they were connected to Players Workshop, and then Players Workshop of Second. So she came and taught on campus, and then in the summer between graduating undergrad and starting my grad studies, I went and did, I think there were several instructors, but the one I remember most is Eric Forsberg, which was Josephine Forsberg's son, over at Players Workshop. So I think that and comedy sports were probably the two recognizable franchises, improv houses, that I worked with, while also creating my own projects on campus, because there it's a bit ridiculous in retrospect, because I've always had an attitude of, if it's not around, just do it, figure it out. And I don't think I realized how much of it was around me that I could have, if I'd had the money and resources, I could have pulled from. But because I didn't have either of those things, it's like, all right, I'm going to try and create a long-form improv musical as an 21-year-old with a bunch of my friends, and we'll figure that out and ask if we can have the O'Malley Theatre at Roosevelt to do it in for 3 or 4 shows. So I think that's where my interest in creating and devising slightly more complicated improv pieces was born very young.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I mean, I feel like it served you well, and it served the improv community at large well. I mean, when I'm talking about groups, though, I mean, it doesn't have to be notable or known. Were you in any, like with Offsides for me? I'm just trying to collect any strange improv group names you may have in you.
Yeah, I think we called ourselves Home Improvement, was the campus troupe that I did. And it was an odd hodgepodge of folks who were just interested and available. And I think the big thing that culminated in was Insta musical Just Add Water, and that was my first attempt at a long-form improv show. And it's telling that of all the ridiculous styles to choose, I chose a musical, flashing back to that moment in my high school career where that was the first moment of sort of for me, So I think I've been chasing that high, and I still am. Like, I get sad on nights I'm playing at SAC and I don't get to sing. It's like, no, that's the high. That's the high I need.
What would have been different, if anything, if you would have known that there's stuff out there, and if you would have learned Harold? Because I feel like because you didn't have that, you were able to construct something entirely new that was uninfluenced by Harold. And if you would have known Harold, then that would have unduly influenced what you were doing, and it wouldn't have been as unique.
Yeah, that's insightful. I've mused about that as well, because I don't think I really bow down at any of the improv altars. I think I've very much got an attitude of, does it work, and does it work for me today? And if it doesn't, I'll try something else. And I think my long form, I've now started calling it dramaturgical long form, because I just don't have a better name. But essentially just meaning researched, deep long form that's more of an homage than it is a sort of shticky parody, that I'm really trying to get to something a little bit more substantial. Not to dismiss other efforts, but that's just the way I like to lean as an improviser. Because I remember seeing my first Harold at I.O. might have been when I was in my 30s or my 40s, so quite a bit into my development. And it might have been Revolver. I think it was like one of the original house teams. I had actually bought a ticket to see the Dowtones, I think it was, and they got preempted because this house team was reforming. And now, to give them fair crack, I think this was literally the first time they'd played together as a group in maybe 8 or 10 years.
Okay.
But I just remember going, oh, this is a Herald? This is what it is? It had had such a name and an energy around it. I was expecting to just be blown away. And it's like, oh, okay, this is what it is. And then I had bought a ticket for something else the following night that got preempted again. I think that's right. And so I think I saw them twice. And the second one was definitely stronger. But I still remember just going, oh, okay, to your point. It's like, yeah, I think if I'd studied that and become committed to mastering that, my proclivity towards just improv problem solving and figuring stuff out a little bit for myself, I think that might have been hampered.
Yeah.
But I think people could also look at my work and go, well, it's a pet peeve. I don't know if you have this as well, that I think some people can look at long form and go, oh, it's just a Herald. It's like, no, a Herald is just a Herald as well. Like, it's just a collection of scenes.
Yeah.
Every play is a collection of scenes, some of which are connected, some of which are subplots. That the Herald structure is really the 5-act structure of scripted theatre, sort of simplified a bit.
Yeah, I think that's insightful, because the ones that I've experienced, I know that there's a lot of stuff that you've done that I haven't had any experience with, but the ones that I have experienced, it was you trying to distill what works in some genre or a version of a scripted piece, and you're saying, okay, these are the beats that are in that, so let's improvise those beats, but we're still creating that same thing. So like the one that I saw, though it's been a while ago now, is Foreplay. I don't think I saw Just Add Water, but
No, that would have been just in Chicago.
okay.
Yeah.
But Foreplay, I mean, you're improvising an entire musical, right?
Yeah. The Foreplay, the improvised musical, is the full title, because otherwise, when we abbreviate it, it sounds a bit saucy.
Yes.
And your podcast might get flagged for the candid discussion of Foreplay.
And it named that because there's 4 people, right?
Yes, spelled Fourplay. But I think very much with a wink. And I also think it'd be fair to say, though, Stephen, that's not everyone's cup of tea, both as a performer and as a improviser. And my own pendulum swings wildly from really quite ornate structures, because I'm not afraid of that. I like that, to much, much looser structures like what I'm doing with Robbie at the moment with R&D. So my own pendulum swings. But yeah, I think for me, I'd seen some improv musicals and I was always a little underwhelmed with the variety in the music. And so for that particular premise, it was like, all right, again, SAC, that was where I first mounted it, and it was, you've got a limited budget, a limited cast, it's going to be 4 people. We had a good band, a really good band. I'd say Jim Reinhardt was the first lead musician for that. So the basic premise was you meet 4 potential protagonists and a family of other 3 characters that each of them have. So by the end of Act 1, you've met 16 characters, and then the audience votes which of those 4 characters is going to go forward into Act 2. And one of the fun finesses was that then we are limited now in our pool of characters to only the other characters that we've already created. And it was ornate, and it had a lot of sort of, this is a different kind of duet that we'll sing at this point of the show, this is a different kind of ballad, this is a different kind of group song, but the content was 100% improvised, as was the music. So even if the musician was like, this is going to be a ballad, we had no idea, what the chord progression or the sound of the ballad was going to be. And I think some of the company who did it sort of was like, it felt almost like an epiphany that you could do improv that way.
Yeah.
And other people, it felt like I had shackled them and taken all of the joy and wrung it out from. And I think I've always struggled a little bit with that. It's like, yeah, I am a particular kind of deviser when it comes to my improv, and that won't be everyone's cup of tea.
Yeah. If I'm understanding correctly, you're saying that comes out of the desire to make sure that there's variety, so that you don't get stuck with everything being a ballad.
Yeah, and that's what I often felt, that I'd go to see some improv, and I hadn't seen a lot of improv musicals, to be honest, so it might have also been an imagined problem at that point. But the ones I had seen, I was like, oh, why are the songs just become vanilla or unimpressive, or they get bailed on, rather than becoming these really finesseful moments? And I've done several musicals since, and I think that's always been a real focus for me. I think the one that I've seen done elsewhere was Showstoppers at Edinburgh Festival. It's an English company where they were playing at such a high level of intelligence with such a great band, a musical director. I was like, yeah, that's what I'm aspiring to accomplish, that level of this feels like a musical. And it's an odd thing to hunt. I know John Stone and others are like, why would you try to create something that looks like a scripted piece. What a waste of your energy. Improv has all of these other gifts. Why would you waste your time trying to make it feel scripted? But I teach both scripted and non-scripted acting, and the adage I'll often use is that for me, really good scripted work feels improvised. It feels like the actors are finding everything in the moment.
Yeah.
And really good improvised work feels like it's scripted, like every word has been perfectly selected, every movement is motivated and has some greater story to tell. So I think in this terrible world where I am divided between those two desires, I am pulled towards those two North Stars.
Yeah, I love that. Let's stick with your history for a minute. So you went from Roosevelt to...
No, it's a very obvious next step, Stephen, why you'd even need to ask. No, so I was in Chicago, just the mecca of North American improv in the 90s, and I'm like, I'm getting on a train and going to cornfields and going to Macomb, Illinois, to study for my MFA at Western Illinois University, which I joke, it actually wasn't a terrible choice. But again, looking back, I'm like, why did I leave, that city at that moment? But like many of our journeys, if I hadn't, I don't think I'd be doing quite what I'm doing now.
Yeah. When I was my senior year, maybe, I don't know when, but the guy that started the college troupe with me was like, hey, Steven, I'm driving down to Detroit and I'm going to audition for Second City. You want to come? And I was like, I've got something to do that day.
Yeah.
I wonder if, and I think I don't think he took it, but I think he was offered, I mean, Detroit didn't last long, I don't think, for Second City, but he was, I think, offered a tour position on one of their touring companies, and I don't think he was able to take it for some reason. I forget why, but it's just, those things is like, hey, that was an interesting transition period, and things would have been way different, possibly, if I would have made a different decision, but no regrets.
Yeah, and I've always, for my education, but I think it holds true to my current life, I grew up poor. I don't dress that in any other language. I say I grew up blue t-shirt, not even blue collar. We couldn't afford the collar on the t-shirt. And it was a small miracle that a scholarship and some fundraising made it possible for me to go to Roosevelt for 4 years. And then when I was looking for grad school, because I remember looking at DePaul and I was in discussions with them. I don't think I ever formally auditioned. I think they were just trying to get me to audition. And I was like, what are the scholarship opportunities? And they're like, well, there's no scholarships for the first year. After your first year, you might become eligible for a scholarship. And it's like, I can't do that. I do not have the money. And because I was not an American, I couldn't get student loans here or anything.
Yeah,
it's like, no, that's an absolute deal breaker. So I won't pretend that finances weren't one of the most important choices, and I got an assistantship to go to Western Illinois that ended up being much more frugal than I was led to believe, so that created its own list of problems. But you can live pretty cheaply in the middle of rural Illinois, and it was such a productive department. We did so much that I didn't have money, but I also didn't have time to feel poor. I was just doing so much all the time.
And then from there you went to...
LSU in Baton Rouge, I say I sort of followed the Mississippi, just
yeah.
And that was similar. I got a fellowship there. There are a lot of good things I could say about Western. Western was actually where I started to first cut my chops as an improv teacher, because I really wanted to... I don't even know if I was creating an improv community there or recreating one. It's so hard to tell in universities half the time. Like, did I start that, or had it just been on hiatus for 6 years because there was no one who wanted to do it for a bit? But I created the Lost Comedies of William Shakespeare, the project that we have in common. That my first iteration of that was at Western Illinois, and that was one of the other aha moments, if I can loiter there for a second.
Yeah, absolutely.
So some of the genesis of that project, if you haven't drank it away. But that was a 4-person cast, and we were creating an improvised Shakespeare comedy, and the basic conceit, which I still love, I've done it once with you and once at Roland since, was this huge slate of suggestions, like a ridiculous slate of suggestions. We're stopping the show from even getting started for 8 minutes slate of suggestions. We got, 30 maybe things up on a whiteboard?
Yeah.
And then as the show's progressing, every time we used something, there was a flare of a gesture, and it would get struck from the blackboard or the slate. And so that by the end of it, that we're hopefully using them all. And I think at that first iteration, I did do prologues, but I don't think I was rhyming them. I think in our iteration, I started to turn them into sonnets, and then that's sort of what happened since. Sorry, that's just to give some background to listeners. I think this may be in 97. So Gene Kozlowski was the head of the department, and he is one of those sort of tough love kind of dads, heads of a department. Like, we all respected him profoundly. He had an incredible eye. He was an amazing director. Someone that you knew he knew his stuff. There was no doubt about it, but you could probably write the compliments he gave in any given academic year on the back of a postage stamp. They were very, very few and far between. And I remember him coming to that show and laughing his way through it, so that's always lovely, especially for an improv show where that's not guaranteed. And then at the end of it said something to the effect of, "You've made me wonder if we're doing this theatre thing all wrong." And that is perhaps one of those few comments in a person's life that sort of has sat with me as a fire for me, I think, in moments where I'm wondering if I'm doing it all wrong. That he saw something in that space on that night that made him sort of have a second thought of what improv is and what it could be. And so that's been, to this day, one of my proudest accomplishments, was that production, because I think it was my first true produced long form, like where it beautiful lights and a custom made set and 4 musicians, and yeah, just really lovely.
So Roosevelt was BFA in...
BA for me. They do offer a BFA, but I opted for the BA because I got a double major in English literature as well.
Okay, so English lit and just theater generally, or?
Yeah, theatre performance,
okay,
is the way it broke up there. And then Western, that was an MFA in theatre performance.
Okay, so the directing of Shakespeare, or the Lost Comedies...
The Lost Comedies, yeah.
...wasn't really related to your degree. It was part of your teaching?
It's sort of a little bit of neither. Do you know what I mean? It's like, because I taught a couple of improv classes, and it was a little bit of a battle because I had fellow master's students who's like, "Oh yeah, I'd like to take improv with you." So I petitioned to have these courses cross-listed as both undergrad and graduate courses, which that's, looking back, I was pretty cocky for like a guy in my early 20s, and I don't think I've taught an improv class at that point. I'd thought a lot about them, but I hadn't taught much, and I did a lot of course design while I was at Roosevelt. Part of my thesis there was I created a sort of a first sampling of a whole bunch of improv games. So I'd started collecting them and trying to think about how you might group them as a teacher. But it was a lovely department that, even though I was there as an actor, you could do other projects. And so I had co-directed a devised piece with Ray Gabika called Ancient Ties, which was some of the graduating students wanted to create a piece together. And so they'd chosen the theme of motherhood. So we devised a piece. That was a lovely experience. So there was several lovely experiences. And there was pushback. I do remember one of the faculty members there going, "It's an improv show. Why does it need a space? Why does it need a theatre?" I think that is definitely a thread, unfortunately. Maybe that would have been the same if I'd stayed in New Zealand as well, but that has definitely been a thread in my American journey of people just going, "What is this? It's not important. Why are we giving resources to this?"
Yeah.
So I did that with Adam Lewis, Kamari Rosa, and Doug Rosenheim were the other 3 performers, and they were all fellow MFA performance folks. And then that bench was fleshed out for the musicians and the design element. I think it was a pretty short run. It was maybe 3 shows. I don't remember that part of it very well, but we were all nervous as get out, and it really did feel like we were literally reinventing theatre. It wasn't just that we were doing an improvised Shakespeare show. It was like, at that point, I don't think I'd known of that being done. It may well have been, but I wasn't mimicking someone else's product or success. It was just like, "Oh, I wonder if we could improvise a Shakespeare show."
Yeah. Did you know when you went to get your MFA that you wanted to keep going after that? Or did you make the decision somewhere in there?
Yeah, that was complicated for me, Stephen, because keeping in mind I'm foreign, right? There was this, if I stopped studying, I'd need to leave the country. I had to have a status that could keep me legal in the country. So I think that was a small part. Well, not a small part of it. That was a considerable part of it. And then that MFA gave me a lot, but I felt I was growing a lot as a practitioner, but I was dying a little bit as an academic.
Okay.
MFA programs, they're focusing on your craft, and I think at that point I was also realizing, I want to know more of the history, I want to know more of the background. I've always been intellectually curious, and there just wasn't room in an MFA. It's like I couldn't take a class over in history or English or something. It's like, no, you're here in the theatre department taking theatre classes. And so, I applied widely to PhD programs. I say widely, there weren't that many then in the late 90s. There might have been, I think I found maybe a dozen that I applied to. And that was a whole journey as well, because I think my assistantship was maybe $350, $380 a month. And even in 1990s dollars, that was $380 a month. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Allowing for inflation, $384 a month. Like it was not much at all. And so the application fees was a month of my income or near about.
Yeah.
I had a month where I was having one meal every 2 days because there just wasn't financial support to fill the gap. It's like, okay, that was pretty bleak. I've never been skinnier. So when I get down on myself for my added pounds, I'm like, you're healthy, David. Good for you. Good for you.
You can eat more than once a day.
Yeah, I can't see my own ribs. Good for me. Good for me. So I cast that net out pretty widely. And this was the same for my MFA. You don't really know what an MFA is until you're in it. You don't know what a BA or a BFA is until you're in it. And I certainly didn't know what a PhD was until I was in it. But I was really lucky. It's a bit of a complicated story, but I was lucky to eventually get a fellowship. I was given a fellowship at LSU, and then it was revoked for complicated reasons that had nothing to do with me. And then when another came available, they very kindly offered me that right when I was on the cusp of accepting. I think it might have been in Athens, Georgia. I don't 100% remember that part of the story. And then moved to LSU, and my friend Doug got a hitch added to his little Festiva car, yellow Festiva, so that he could help me take my stuff down from Western to Baton Rouge. He's a very good friend. And that's where the next 5 years was there in Baton Rouge studying. PhDs are interesting things in the States. People in shorthand have said, oh, you got it in improv, and there is some truth to that, but the PhDs in theatre history, dramatic literature, and criticism, right, that's the title or the field of a theatre PhD in most cases. But then as you're taking your coursework, every course I could, the term papers I was handing in, they would be with an improv focus because you often got to write in the area that you were interested. And that's when I started to sort of amass what the idea would be behind my dissertation, which was on global improv practices as well.
Yeah, I believe I had heard as well that your PhD was in improv. I don't know where I heard that. And it was, in a way, right?
Yeah, I avoid saying that because I feel like it's potentially misleading because such a degree I don't believe exists. But I do think historically I am probably in a pretty small handful in the early 90s of people who could claim to have that as the focus of their PhD studies. It wouldn't have been many of us. I remember my dissertation advisor doing a search to see, when you're writing your dissertation, there's always this fear that someone else is going to scoop you and do your area. When you write your abstract, those are shared amongst various university institutions. And so you always are doing a search to make sure your area is new. And I think someone was doing something about Second City, and that I think she just didn't understand that that was quite markedly different from where I was writing. So I think she expressed a little concern, but I'm like, those are two very different things.
Yeah. And then, so what happened then after you got your PhD? You wouldn't have been in the education system anymore.
No, and that's where I was really lucky. I got an additional fellowship to give me a fifth year to finish the writing process of my dissertation, because that's big work, that's hard work.
Yeah.
And luckily I had been writing ahead, so during that last fifth year I was also really going into the job market, and that's when I got the nibble from Rollins and got the on-site interview and got brought out, and I was beyond lucky. I landed a job in a teaching theatre and performance in a small liberal arts private college with a great reputation in Winter Park, Florida. And that was my first step up to the bat. And they were very aggressive in their recruiting under the dean at that time. So if they wanted you, they offered you early in the process, because that way you wouldn't have other offers on the table. So that just made me pull. I don't know if I would have got anything else, but it became I remember my advisor when I told her what I was being offered, because I had no idea. It's like, is this a good number? Is this a bad number? And she was like, that's more than I'm getting paid at LSU. So I'm like, okay. Now that speaks more to how badly LSU was paying, perhaps than anything. And when I now look back at how long it has taken me to get from that number to something that feels like it was worth spending 12 years of my life in higher education as a student, right? That was quite a long journey. That was very recently that it's like, oh yeah, this number's okay now. Yeah.
So you moved to the Orlando area.
Yeah.
When did you get connected to improv? Did you start to try to create something again before you found out there was stuff around?
I must have done, because again, that was 2003, where I remember SAC's internet presence, because the internet was definitely around in 2003, but it was not anything particularly suave. And so I remember it was like their homepage was one of those endlessly scrolling pages of just text with information. I think it was in that first semester, so the fall of 2003. I think I don't remember if I came to see a show first or if I called, but I just called and said, look, I've moved into the area. I've been improvising professionally for a while. And the response was, I won't out the person who gave me the response, but you know the timelines of SAC that you might be able to guess. And the response was, so we offer level 1. So it's like, oh, okay. And then it's like, how hard do I press? Because also at that point, I've been improvising a lot, but LSU, Baton Rouge certainly didn't have an improv community. I very much created the improv community there and did some huge shows on campus and had a troupe there called the Improvisers, very original title. But doing kind of cool long form stuff, a lot of that long form still stayed with me to this day. Like my current show variations on the theme that I do on campus was an extension of E Pluribus Unum that I'd done there at LSU. Sorry, backstory. But it was also that moment of, but how good am I? I haven't played in a brick and mortar improv company at that point since Chicago, the comedy sports, because the same with Western Illinois and Macomb. I was the improv community there. I generated it. I largely generated it at LSU as well. Again, it may have existed before and after me, but I don't think there was much else there while I was there. And so I don't remember how I finagled it, but at some point I got into that sort of apprentice position where it's like, come on in and play some shows. Right? It's like, okay. And then again, not knowing SAC, not knowing the history, not knowing that people can live in a purgatory of apprenticing for 12 years or be in the classes and be in limbo for 20 years. Like, I just had no idea of any of the sort of normal practices. Because I remember it was after maybe 4 shows that I was like, I'm not sure if I can keep affording to come down here and pay parking without being, like that. And that's where my mind is. And then this may have been coincidence, but it's the way I tend to think of it. And then Brendan Jennings left, who is an astounding improviser. Yeah. I still remember the gut laughter that I experienced on stage with him, just beyond gleeful. Charles Fryman would probably be up there too, in terms of people who their joy of what's happening on stage is so contagious and just so elevating. So around that time, he was looking to move to LA. So I think the powers that be were looking to fill spots. And again, tying back to musical improv, this can be the thread if you want it to be, or you can ignore it. I think the fact that I was a pretty confident musical improviser, and this is total speculation, but I believe that is probably what made me just stand a little bit taller than other very good homegrown improvisers who were in the pool. I think that skill is a little bit more definable when you're like, oh, that guy can sing a whole song for us. That can make you stand out a little bit. Yeah. And so I think by 2004, maybe very early 2004, I was in the ensemble at that point. So yeah, my time with SAC is almost exactly the same as my time with Rollins.
SAC has always valued musicality because it's been a very musical theater. I can see how that would definitely be a check in your pro column.
Yeah, I don't know if that's me being modest, immodest, or completely oblivious to my deficits. Do you know what I mean? Maybe I was just a really good improviser all round and the singing was irrelevant. That might be a nicer way for me to remember that, right?
Well, no, it's a thing that puts you over the top.
Yeah. Well, because again, looking backward, it's like when we talk about Chicago and I realized just what was happening in the early 90s in Chicago and what an idiot I wasn't for not knowing it at the time. But yeah, looking back, I also realized how deep the bench of waiting improvisers were. So I really do think I was very, very lucky to just have arrived at a moment and to be seen by the right couple of people at the right moment and to maybe just be that right or the most right combination in that moment. And then, SAC's been my home. I had a short hiatus of about a year and a half when I was with Comedy Warehouse at Disney, but even then I would try to get back to SAC occasionally just because there's a community there. I felt really lucky to play at Disney, but the energy was very different. That was just a very polished show, but a very polished show under very commercial circumstances, so the joy wasn't always as high as the quality of the product.
Was Robbie there as well when you were there?
Yes, so I think me and you have a pretty long history in terms of our first shows together, but I think Robbie would rival that because he was something called a Fire Squad member, him and Joy. And so they were cast for both Comedy Warehouse, but also the Adventurers Club, which was the immersive, interactive venue that was sort of next door, and we shared a green room. So he would do some nights with Adventurers Club and some nights with Comedy Warehouse, often filling in the spots of people who were on vacations and the like. The machinery needed some flexibility. So, I do remember very well playing with Robbie then. That's when I think we first became colleagues and friends. And then him coming to SAC, that feels actually much more recent, although the number may still be quite large. It may be 6 or 8 years. And then, we played together a lot, though, in recent years, and that's where the genesis of this project we've talked a little bit about, this R&D show project, came up as well.
It's different when you're watching it just on YouTube, obviously, than when you're present in the space. But when we were watching it, I told Kayla, I said it has a Comedy Warehouse quality about it in a good way, not in.
What do you mean by that, Steven?
But just some of the playfulness between you two. I only saw one show, I think, at Comedy Warehouse, so obviously I'm an expert. And that was when I'd come down. My college roommate had moved down to Orlando because he got a job at Disney, and then I came down to visit him, and he took me to Comedy Warehouse. We went there and we watched the show. There was a song I can still remember a tiny little bit of that they sang after they called one of the tables.
Yeah. That was their stock opening. Yeah. Oh, great opening. But again, it's weird to say the historian in me, but I think I can claim that as a title with a PhD. That's not too wanky, is it? But I was personally crushed when that venue closed because it felt like this little gem of people were making a living doing improv and not teaching improv and doing corporate shows and managing and answering the phone and then getting to improvise a little bit on a Friday. We were doing 5 nights a week, I think 4 to 6 shows a night. They were one-act shows, but still a lot of improv. And so when that closes, that may nearly be it for North America in terms of a venue that is paying a living wage to 10 or 12 improvisers to just improvise with benefits. It felt like a really sad moment for the art form.
Yeah.
Regardless of whether people like short form or long form or all of that white noise, but just in terms of, and there were some folks had played there since the beginning of that venue, which at that point I think was 20 something years. So I was speculating Mary Thompson Hunt may literally in the modern period at that point have been the person who had done the most viewed improv on stage. That level of improv output, I think could have potentially been literally unrivaled statistically, especially for that style. It gets more complicated when we talk about street and immersive theatre stuff because that can go for hours and hours and hours. But in terms of, doing short form games in front of an audience.
Yeah, I think she was in the show that I saw as well, which probably it stands to reason if your statistics are correct.
Yeah.
And the show I remember being amazing, and like I said, I still remember a little bit of it. And I was also, as a young improviser in Orlando when it closed, I was like, oh, well, there's one option off the table.
No, and that's one of the good-spirited discussions I have with current management of SAC a lot as well, is this need for aspirational work, that I understand that we want to keep the lights on and the doors open, but there's a part of me, it's like, I don't want to settle for just what other companies are doing. There's a part of me that just has a drive and a need to keep breaking the model of what I think improv is and pushing myself to figure out what the next thing is.
Yeah.
And that I want to be creating work that people are like, well, I might not like it, but I know it's going to be interesting. I know it's not going to be a thing I've seen in every other improv venue in North America, that there's something different happening.
Yeah.
And maybe that's an unfair expectation to set myself, but it is something I think a lot about as an improv deviser.
Yeah, when you come to a David Charles show, you don't necessarily know what you're going to get, but I can tell you what you're not going to get, and that is someone bungee jumping off the Eiffel Tower into a flavor of Jell-O.
A flavor of Jell-O, yeah. I feel now you're challenging me to find a way of weave that. I think when you see the next advertisement for my new long form and it's called Bungee Jump, right? You'll know I have unwrapped that improv riddle.
No, you just need to do 5 things as your opening for R&D.
Yeah. I don't think I'll be pulling that into a full length
show.
But who knows, if this takes off and we're doing it in another 5 years, I might be running out of short form.
You'll know you've hit the bottom of the barrel.
Yeah.
There's
sorry,
down there too.
We love you, Comedy Sports.
Yes.
We love you. Yeah, we're sorry.
So when you look back at your body of work, Is there anything that stands out to you in terms of moments of where things went awry that you can laugh at now but weren't necessarily super funny for you in the moment, or anything you've seen you weren't necessarily a part of that where things went awry?
That's a fascinating question. I think because I'm, for good or evil, when I direct a lot of my more complicated stuff, I'm in it for myriad reasons. Some of it is just, I should say no one else is directing the kind of improv I want to do. That is not true. But there's not a lot of it, and there's certainly not a lot of it locally. I would have to travel to gain those kinds of experiences. So the reason I preface your question with that is like, so I'm on stage in these shows, and therefore I have to just grit my way back onto the train tracks. So if it goes awry, I'm sure there have been thousands of those moments, Stephen. Yeah. But I think, especially when I work with students, and that's not to denigrate my students, but when I do these kinds of big projects on my home campus at Rollins, that's partially why I cast myself. I essentially call it internal directing, which others might just call control and annoying. The line is fine. But the notion that hopefully, if things go wonky, that there's someone just with a little bit more experience in the mix, who has an eye on the whole a little bit more than just what an individual's experience is. But no, I wish I had a good story loaded for you, but I've definitely had those moments, as we all have, in terms of getting just terrible suggestions from the audience and having to wrangle them in careful ways, having the teammate who needed to remember the thing being the one teammate who didn't, and then everyone else remembers the thing, right? Yeah. And I don't want to out specific improvisers, but I had one of those moments recently where everyone was brilliantly on the same page except for the one improviser who needed to be, and then we had this kick moment of like, do we embrace what they have just said, knowing that the whole audience knows that it flies in the face of everything we've just done for the last hour, or do we lovingly correct them? And I think we actually erred on the side of lovingly correct, which I'm becoming to think that's more and more the thing. Like when we talk about no mistakes in improv, there are mistakes in improv. There are moments when everyone's like, you know what, that was a mistake. We are all okay with acknowledging that and then forging a new path forward. That is not the worst thing in the world.
Yeah. Do you think one of the things that prevents something from popping in your mind, so a long time ago, and maybe it was when I had Jay for level 3, so maybe it was in my level 3 class with Jay, somebody asked him a question about remembering a show, and he said he's done so many that you don't remember them, but what you remember is the really, really good stuff and the really, really bad stuff. But I would posit that being someone who teaches so often and is so much a part of student performances that you don't see the mistakes as starkly as maybe someone would who isn't a part of that because of the learning process involved, and you're taking it from this was a huge mistake into here's what we can learn from this and how we can turn that into something more than just holy cow, I can't believe that happened on stage.
No, I think that's astute. And so I just did last night with Rollins Improv Plaza on campus, we did a show. It's called a Cut To, and the format will resemble the Cut To that you know. Like improvisers know that as a sort of a public domain format where you just are moving backwards and forwards in time. But we do it as a full opus of a 55-minute show. And it focuses on two characters and their relationship and all the people that connect. So I'm the sort of designated caller. It's not called internally. And we really try to get stories of value where it has a bit of a playback feel in terms of its opening, that we elicit a whole story from an audience member, but we don't try to recreate it. We're just using that as the starting point. And in that show, I was trying to do this slight finesse. I was trying to have a character who I had become competitive with another character. I should use names or it's going to be absolutely one of those horrific improv stories that makes no sense. So Emmy and Grace were co-workers. Grace had just had a child with their partner Morgan, and so wasn't in the workplace, and then had bumped into Emmy, and I had put in the intro to the scene that Emmy got the promotion that Grace should have got. So it was this idea of fueling that conflict that often happens for many of us when family and career start to collide. And so Grace is upset that Emmy got the promotion. She's reconsidering whether she should be taking time off to be home with her new child. So that scene had gone, and it was a lovely, lovely scene. And so I was like, all right, how do I amplify that? The what-if game. If this is true, what else is true? So I'm like, okay, let me look at Emmy's character and what has motivated her to be so gleeful and gloating in this victory. And I'm like, oh, what if Emmy loved Morgan and Morgan was the one that got away? So Grace is now married and having a child with the person that Emmy loved, right? And I'm like, oh, that's cool. Well, just in that very meandering description of my thought process. That is not an easy thing to suddenly, we call them bows, right? To go cut to 2025, Emmy at the supermarket bumps and blah, blah, and it came out as this absolute string of nonsense. And to Emmy's credit, after the show, is like, did anyone understand what I was going for there? And because Emmy knows me pretty well, she's been in the troupe for a couple of years now. She's like, no, I got the vibe of it. But the audience, they all went, huh? There was this very lovely, it sort of speaks to the community we have on campus too, right? Because I'm a teacher for many of them, and they didn't think twice for a second of just having this collective, what the hell, David? What was that mess? And so in that moment, I'm like, yeah, that was a train wreck. If they tried to improvise a scene based on that little intro, it would just be a disaster. And I'm like, fair enough, do over. And then I rang the bell again and gave an only modestly better version of it. But it was, but to your point though, it was this utter failure of a moment, and maybe 20-year-old David would have sat with that, but there was truly a sense, we post with best and worst for our shows, and I was like, my worst was that absolute train wreck of an introduction. My best was laughing it off so quickly with the audience and just moving on. And it could have punctured the show had I been proud and no, that's what like if I had been defensive about my absolute mess up. I think those do happen a lot. And I do get pouty if in a short form game, like you'll have your favorites and I have my favorites, and I get pouty sometimes if I'm playing one of my favorite games with someone and they just don't get the game. Yeah. It's just like, this is one of my favorite games. I want to play this well. And so I can walk away and get a bit pouty, just in the same way that I'm sure I'm not great to play with in those moments either, because they're probably looking at me going, why is David looking at me like I'm destroying his joy? That's not a great energy to play opposite either. So I will own that too. So I don't know if that fits the bill of your question completely, Stephen.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, I don't know if this fits the bill, but I do want to ask you, I have some recollections of some things, and we'll see if you remember any more or if I made them up in my brain.
Also, this is the intervention moment, right? We like, the real reason you're on the show is there are these 8 things you did to me during Lost Comedies, and I...
No, I do have some vivid memories of Lost Comedies. The most vivid, I think, is me and Dinger in a boat, and a tree is growing in the middle of the boat.
Oh.
And I know one of the suggestions got scratched off, maybe because of the, I don't know if tree boat was on there. I don't know what it was. But I remember that. But no, I remember what I was going to say is I feel like, and I don't know if this was Gorilla, because I don't know when was Dinger in Gorilla?
Yeah, no, Dinger. Yes. Well, Chris Dinger, we both love you when you hear this moment. Like, we could say physically Chris Dinger was in Gorilla, sometimes sometimes metaphysically. I think this might be after you had left Orlando in that show, but he would confess as much. Like, he would be messaging a good mutual friend, Greg, just for things to torture me with in the show. Like, what are games that will make David absolutely squirm, or what are things? And he would show me these threads of them laughing about the stuff that Chris was going to do to me that night.
Yes, that's what I was going to bring up, is I remember Dinger torturing you, but I feel like he had a proclivity for that even before we left. And the scene that I'm remembering, and I don't know if you remember this at all, but it was one of those moments where I was like, I don't know how, because you laughed and you took it and you moved with it, but we could tell that it was like, I mean, that was one of those play within the play sort of thing. So I think everyone knew what Dinger was doing to you.
Yeah.
And you were responding to that as much as you were responding in the scene. But it was, I think you were maybe his dad, and you saw it coming and you were trying to mitigate it by endowing him with certain things. And I think maybe he still did his thing where he wheeled himself out as if he were in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
And then he gave himself some terrible disease. And,
I don't remember this, but as you're describing it, I have no doubt in the factual accuracy. Do you know what I mean? Because you are combining so many of my arguably favorite Chris moments. That's the thing with him. You describe the behavior in it to an outsider, it sounds absolutely awful. And then when you're in the space, the whole audience is eating out of his hand. Eating out of his hand.
And I think it culminated in maybe there was a pet elephant and that he had that was like the only joy his character had in the world, and he somehow made it that you had killed it. And then he had nothing left to live for, something I don't know what it was, and you were trying to revive this imaginary elephant or
I talk about Chris a bit on campus in terms to my troupe of, you've played with me. I'm linear. I am story driven. I think I can be a bit of a mischief maker too. I don't think I'm not that, but I think my proclivities are like, let's tell a good story. Let's be real people. I try to lean into that column as much as I can. So there is something insanely liberating and intoxicating about that combination, both as a player and I imagine as an audience, when you get that guy, this type A, slightly control freak guy, with the absolute juvenile mischief maker. I'm going to create the most uncomfortable scenarios I can for you and watch you squirm. And he is uniquely gifted at that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is what I would compare it to. So there's a story, and I don't know if this is 100% true or not, but I believe it to be true, that when they were doing the Garfield movie, that Bill Murray, first of all, I guess he didn't read exactly the names right and thought it was a different set of Coen brothers that was producing that movie, or that may have been a different movie. But anyway, so he's doing Garfield and he's looking at the script and he's thinking, this is terrible, but I can fix this. So he would change some of the dialogue as he was going and really kind of punch it up and make it better as he was recording the dialogue. Then the next day he would come in and he would get the new pages and it was like, oh my God, what have I done? Because I have to make sense of what I did yesterday with the pages they gave me today.
So he has to track his improv in a script. Yeah. Oof. Yeah.
So it was a terrible experience for him because every day it just compounded. And I feel like that's what Dinger does to you. You're the linear, I mean, you have this thing kind of not planned out, but it's like, okay, these are the offers. I see several clear roads. I could go down any of these roads, improviser mind. And then Dinger just says, oh yeah, and then knocks you off the track. But then that just keeps compounding it as you go. So you can you're off balance then for the rest of the scene.
Yeah, and it's I think to extend your metaphor, I think, again, I'm an improviser who doesn't think it's a crime to come in with something in your pocket. You just have to be willing to throw it away.
Yeah.
But yeah, if I've got some tracks that I'm loosely contemplating, he pushes me into the ocean. It's like, so it's like, now there is no possibility. And frankly, though, especially when you've improvised as long as we have, like, isn't that a gift? It's like, and I think he would testify that the opposite is true, that his mischief making is empowered by knowing someone's going to take care a little bit of the narrative.
Yeah.
That he can play with that sense of abandon because he doesn't have to wonder if there's going to be an out for the scene. That's
right.
And to some degree, like Robbie, in this R&D project we've talked about a little bit, that's in my current child at SAC. Robbie's a different kind of mischief maker, but he has the same absolute embrace of not caring if he knows where we're going.
Yeah.
And that's why I think that particular project, we've had some moments of magic because he sort of empowered me to come up with the concepts for Act 1 at the moment. That may change down the road, and I'd be happy if it did. But it means that because I'm designing what might the short form look like, in doing that, I can't help but be thinking a little bit about it.
Yeah.
And he probably is as well, but in a very different way. So that when we come to the stage and truly, there's no rehearsal, there's no walking through the beats of it. We might talk through the vague transition ideas just so that our technician has some idea what the heck we're doing. I find that as well. It's that adage of, I think when you're young, you're like, I wish I could clone myself and improvise with myself. And then as you get older, you're like, that would be the most boring, most unwatchable improv imaginable. It'd be predictable and stale and without any sense of surprise or life. This might be in one of Halpin's books, but there's some story, again, I believe it's true, Stephen, I don't know it's true, I believe it's true, of a Harold team where there was a mischief maker in the Harold team who was just really irritating all the other members, and they petitioned to have him, obviously it was a him removed. And then the next time they performed, there was absolutely no chemistry in the group. All of the things that he was doing that was annoying, that were also opening doorways for them and providing possibilities, right? And so I think it's very humbling, isn't it, that sometimes the things that sort of annoy us on some level, when you really reflect on them, you're like, no, that needs to be there. That quality needs to be on the stage as well.
Yeah. Well, and there was something magical about that alchemy, and I imagine still is, between you and Dinger, because it was the audience enjoying the scene, but also enjoying Dinger and David. And that what was going on there, because they knew, but also, that works when there's a lot of trust between those players. It doesn't work as well if one player isn't trusting the other player, because I never saw you get upset about that.
Yeah, if I got upset with anything, it was just like, Chris, can you come up with your theme for Gorilla before 1 minute? of going on. That would be, I probably got a bit punchy about that on occasion. But no, and I think I'd include you in this number. We really have been blessed with playing with quite an incredible talent pool, and I think Orlando in particular, and it's probably because of the theme parks, frankly, that there's this catchment area where we're playing with people who, in addition to sort of the lovely category of professional amateurs who improv is a sort of an adjacent to their biochem lab job, it's just something they're doing on the side and they are superlative at it, but we also have this stable of professional actors who are acting in the parks every day and have this incredible flair for interplay and understanding an audience. And so it can become jarring when that ensemble suddenly has newer members who don't have that rapport, because if you try to mimic what a more veteran player is doing and you haven't earned it, you don't know from whence it came, it can feel very jarring for an audience.
Yeah.
Like Jay can berate an audience, right?
Right.
Jay Hopkins can berate an audience. I've seen very few improvisers who can do that and remain charming and likable and really pulling people in.
Yeah, he's one of my examples for that too. Yeah, I could never do that on stage. That doesn't work for me. I can't do that. But Jay is masterful at it.
Yeah, and I think that's the beautiful thing of improv ensemble, is that we can look at each other and go, okay, Stephen excels at blank, David excels at blank, put them together. You're going to get something better than the sum of the parts.
Yeah.
And that's the magic of, I don't know how much you've taught improv, Steve, to my detriment, so forgive me for that lacuna in my history with you, but teaching on a campus, that is one of the most profound things for me that keeps it incredibly fresh and invigorating, is watching students discover that being themselves is enough on the improv stage, and that being funny isn't the be-all, end-all, and that they actually are funny, but they're the funniest when they're just being themselves. And watching those, we do about 24, 30 shows a year with Rip. It's a pretty, for an improv troupe, it's a pretty big slate of shows, and I'm directing or hosting or in the space for all of them. And those are some of my just favorite memories as a teacher and as a faculty member at Rollins, is just being in that space and having the privilege of watching those cool dynamics and fireworks.
That's it for part 1 of my interview with Dr. D. Check out his links in the show notes and bring him to your theater for a workshop or to direct one of his shows. You will not regret it. David has also created an amazing resource with the Improv Dictionary, which he wrote and is published by Routledge Press. Check it out. Look it up wherever you buy your books. Get a copy. It's an amazing resource. As always, reach out to me at improvbrain@gmail.com with questions or comments or recommendations for folk I should interview, and thanks for listening to Improv Autopsy.